Welcome to our second panel, Impact on Victims. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to start by saying what a pleasure and a privilege it has been to help organize this conference. Accounting for the impact of the destruction of culture on victims is no easy task. The psychological effects of such trauma include feelings of grief, humiliation, defeat, and loss. There are social costs as well. Connections between generations, communities, families, and friends are broken. History, cultural practices, and forms of aesthetic expression have been suppressed or lost, impoverishing us all over generations. Yesterday's remarks focus on researching the provenance of stolen and looted art during the Holocaust, where the stakes primarily involve arguing one person's ownership over another's. But what about cases with no documentation, or in cultures where notions of ownership are more communal or custodial? The loss of material objects, including art, artifacts, and architecture, is just the tip of the iceberg. New discussions of intangible heritage have brought attention to embodied forms of culture, music and dance, stories and ritual, that are essential to group identity, and also possible to destroy. As we know all too well from the Canadian case, even people can be plundered through expropriating children and putting them in residential schools. To move ahead toward more just practices, we need to develop new ways of thinking productively across the varied histories and cultures of violence and expropriation. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Sherry Farrell Racette. And to read about our esteemed panelists, I invite you all to consult the programs, and this will help us to keep the introduction shorter.
It's me? All right, put my timer on. In Canada, internal genocide originating in colonial times is the great national blind spot. And unlike other nations and peoples, ours has been a slow, relentless dance, not confined to any single cause, cataclysmic event, or even one enemy. For those unfamiliar with Canada's Indigenous peoples, a quick history lesson. North American Indigenous populations have been decimated to the point where population estimates for the periods prior to contact or even prior to the advent of systemic censuses vary widely and are highly contentious. On the North American continent, more than 500 distinct nations, population in the millions. In Canada, approximately 2 million, vastly different cultures established for thousands of years. In the early contact period, over 80 distinct nations, each with their own language belonging to 11 different linguistic groups, as different from one another as Chinese is to French. During the early colonial period, the Métis emerged, a large population of people of mixed ancestry with a syncretic culture that absorbed aspects of European culture into an indigenous core. 3 centuries of indigenous depopulation through war, disease, and famine, helped along by the extermination policies of various governments and colonial powers, has often been viewed as divine providence. By the turn of the 20th century, there were only 100,000 First Nations in the entire country, and an unspecified number of Métis and Inuit. Conveniently, it appeared colonial fantasies were to become reality. We were indeed vanishing. This is generally described in mysterious language. We disappear. There were few wars waged directly against us. We were instead more often, as Alan Corbier pointed out, allies in colonial wars, often with devastating consequences. Violence was manifested in other ways. This has enabled Canadians to see genocide elsewhere, but rarely at home. The Canadian Human Rights Museum refuses to validate our experiences as compared to others. In a highly contentious decision this past July, not to use the experiences of Indigenous peoples in the museum or identify them as genocide. To understand our loss of control over our material culture heritage, our plundered and stolen culture, one must look at the complex array of factors that merged and overlapped as we went from sovereign nations to wards of the state lacking the most fundamental rights of citizenship. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 validated the sovereignty of our nation, stating that colonial expansion could not occur before treaties and land surrenders were negotiated with individual nations. An Indian department had existed since 1755, associated with the military and the War Department, but became a separate department in 1862. 1867, the British North America Act creates Canada. 3 years later, the Hudson's Bay Company transfers its colonial interests in the vast territory known as Rupert's Land, which triggered the first Métis resistance in 1869-70. In Western Canada, 1871 marked the beginning of the treaty-making process, making way for settlement as First Nations gradually moved on to lands reserved for Indians, better known as reserves. In 1876, all legislation pertaining to First Nations was cobbled together into an act respecting Indians, better known as the Indian Act, a Canadian statute through which subsequent amendments and legislation defines the relationship between First Nations, those recognized as Indians by the state, and the Government of Canada. 4 years later, in 1881, Department of Indian Affairs officials, including Indian agents in charge of administering individual reserves, were granted the powers of justices of the peace and magistrates in matters regarding the Indian Act. In addition, the Northwest Mounted Police, later the RCMP, were charged with enforcing the Act. In 1885, tensions arose from the government's starvation policies and reluctance to protect Métis lands, resulting in the military defeat of both the Cree and the Métis. It is known in the Cree language as when it all went wrong. The aftermath saw massive land loss, displacement, and for those living under the jurisdiction of the Indian Act, a further loss of political power as traditional governments were stripped of power. A pass system was implemented, restricting and highly controlling freedom of movement, and the powers of the Indian agent was increased. For much of Canada's existence as a nation, First Nations people have lived as colonized and subjective non-citizens under strict state control. Lacking the most basic civil rights, we lived in a segregated world strategically set apart. Dual strategies undertaken by the Canadian government outlawed cultural expression while simultaneously imposing a rigorous form of forced assimilation. Whoops, out of order here. Key to plundered heritage is Section 149, an amendment to the Indian Act which initially outlawed the potlatch ceremonies of the Northwest Coast, but in successive amendments made between 1886 and 1915, expanded to outlaw all traditional ceremonies, spiritual practices, and traditional dance. Known as the culture ban, this oppressive legislation was a critical factor in the lives of Aboriginal people living under the jurisdiction of the Act until removed in 1951. We didn't get the vote until 1960. The culture ban overlapped with a global period of new imperialism marked by waves of colonial expansion accompanied by mass seizures and displays of cultural treasures and occasionally people, sometimes living but mostly dead. This is the period of the human zoos. What was it about acquiring our cultural heritage and, in fact, our bodies that enhanced the national identities of those nations who did the collecting? Consider this small collection of important Dene material that now resides in the National Museum of Scotland, collected through the networks of the Northern Hudson Bay Company Post. These materials somehow increased Scotland's civilization and its power to civilize, or rather Scotland's ability to stand among the world's colonial powers. Never having its own colonial territories, although active in Great Britain's, Scotland could acquire colonial capital through collecting. Throughout this period, Wild West shows, human zoos, and expositions used display, possession, and performance to reinforce the dichotomies of civilized and savage, colonized and colonizer, the powerful and the powerless. Eugenics and social Darwinism created and reinforced notions of human development, first articulated through the bodies and possessions of Indigenous peoples globally, foreshadowing the rise of fascism and the genocides of the Holocaust. In anticipation of our demise, salvage anthropology spread its tentacles into Indigenous communities around the world, seeking the pure, the unadulterated, the unchanging, with an obsessive need to fix Indigenous peoples firmly in the past. During this period, items given as diplomatic gifts and visual signifiers documenting treaties and contractual agreements lost their textual significance and became ornamental colonial booty. Soto chief and Treaty 4 negotiator and signator Louis O'Soup's shirt was gifted to Lieutenant Governor Morris at the signing of Treaty 4. It visually represents the relationship of fictive kin or brotherhood articulated in the treaty, but it is no longer seen as a reminder of the obligations of that sacred relationship and is merely displayed silently in the British Museum. The 1921 revision of Section 149 of the Indian Act hardened and expanded the cultural ban beyond the Northwest Coast. The official policy of the Department of Indian Affairs was that all confiscated goods were property of the Canadian state to be distributed among designated museums. But the financial value of individual items proved too tempting. Ceremonies were held in secret. My daughter's late father recalled being part of a communication network of little boys sent to climb trees and hide in bushes to watch for the Indian agent or the police. But sometimes a Christian convert or someone seeking favor would leak the location to the priest, who would then contact the Indian agent, who would then summon the RCMP. The ceremony would be raided, pipes, drums, bundles, and any number of precious items would be seized. Secretly, triumvirates of priest, Indian agent, police officer would contact dealers and collectors, sell items illegally, and divide the proceeds. The loss of key ceremonial items has been compared to the severing of a limb, where the bleeding would never stop. At the same time, part of that illogic and irrational, rational thinking that we heard earlier, controlled displays and performances of First Nations culture became important demonstrations of Canadian nationalism on the global stage. Here at the Chicago World's Fair, an outlawed ceremony is performed. Simultaneously, children were removed from their homes and confined in residential and industrial schools, initially voluntarily, but as parents opposed their restrictive and punitive practices, attendance was made mandatory and resistant parents arrested and their children seized. In 1893, Chicago's World Columbian Exposition, conceived as a celebration of colonization, required the participation of global indigenous peoples against whom the advancement of European civilization could be projected. Indian Commissioner Hayter Reed viewed the department's participation as success, declaring it an opportunity of demonstrating to the public the results of the policy of education by exhibiting some of that captured heritage, an interesting collection of native dresses, specimens of ornamentation and bead and quill work exhibited next to penmanship and composition produced at Indian schools. And their exhibition included a living exhibition of children who, and this is the words of the annual report, who had been for some time inmates of Canada's industrial schools. So this gives you an example of, most recently, Ian Mosby's recent article this summer revealed medical and nutritional experiments conducted against with the captive bodies of children in First Nations residential schools in the 1940s and 1950s. The first arrests under the culture ban occurred in 1921 at Alert Bay, just off the coast of Vancouver Island. Kwakwaka'wakw youth elder Dan Kramer recalled hosting a potlatch on an isolated island where they hoped to pray and celebrate in private, but the Indian agents summoned the RCMP and 45 people were arrested. The crimes with which they were charged ranged from giving speeches, that was a crime, dancing, that was a crime, carrying gifts, that was also a crime. The community was offered a deal: surrender your treasures in exchange for lighter sentences. 20 men and women were imprisoned for sentences ranging between 2 to 3 months. The victorious Indian agent displayed the captured goods in the Anglican Parish Hall, on the left, in Alert Bay. He charged admission, photographed it enthusiastically, and sold 33 pieces to New York collector George Hay. The Department of Indian Affairs intervened, declaring the items their property, shipped the collection east, and divided most of the collection between the Royal Ontario Museum and what was to become the Canadian Museum of Civilization, now the Canadian Museum of History. Some pieces ended up in the private collections of arresting officers, prosecutors, and Department of Indian Affairs employees, and many of these drifted into the open market and from there around the world. The people of Alert Bay continue to seek them. Whoops, how did that happen? Okay. As the Umista Cultural Society website states, since 1922, some of our most treasured masks and ceremonial objects have been in the hands of museums in Canada, England, and the United States. After decades of searching, wrangling, and negotiation, some confiscated treasures were repatriated. I was fortunate to be at a conference in Vancouver the year the Royal Ontario Museum's collection was returned, and the Society published a commemorative calendar illustrating each month with a photograph of the owner. In most photographs, the traditional owners were elders, but the one that sticks with me is a photograph of children, twins, posing with the objects that were their traditional inheritance. Most are now housed in the Society's museum. Oh, wait, I know what I was doing. Okay. Another form of plunder is intellectual confinement and erasure. We not only lost the actual objects, we lost control of how those objects are understood. Museum anthropologists seeking an efficient way to categorize, store, and exhibit collections developed a system of culture areas which divided the content into environmental zones. It became a widely adapted system still in use today, although it originated in 1895. It has limited usefulness in understanding the objects in relation to their original homes, largely because some nations just can't seem to stay put in their dang zones. They keep sprawling over the lines, particularly the Métis. Having confronted the Canadian state in 2 armed resistances, Métis people continue to fight for recognition, most recently winning 2 Supreme Court decisions. Their political and legal erasure was echoed in classification systems that only recognized Indians. Although their material was widely sold and collected, it most often entered museum collections stripped or to be stripped of family and community identification. That's a Racette. These are details of a beaded fire bag collected by the Earl of South Esk in 1859-1860, photographed by myself in Scotland. Although clearly identified as made by Red River half-breeds in his published travel narrative, the Sotheby catalog prepared for the 2006 sale identified them as Cree, enhancing their value to the consumers they sought to attract. Purity still translates into capital even when it's imaginary. What drives me and all other Indigenous people who seek our collective treasures is not only to find the objects, but to reclaim the knowledge embedded within them. Sometimes we have a story, a memory, and we are looking for an object that fits that description. Our loss is not only the loss or theft of the actual object, our loss is also the struggle to reclaim and recover from the long years of confinement where our movement, religious freedom, and the right to raise our own children was restricted for 4 generations. I'm sure Louis O'Soup didn't think as he pulled off his beautiful shirt, this will be the last shirt my community will ever make, and I'm sure the women who beaded this beautiful bag didn't think, I'll never make one of these, my daughters will never have a chance to learn from me. These layers of history and pain make the most humble object highly charged with emotion. I was one of the many people who assisted the Royal Alberta Museum in their acquisition of the South Esk collection, seeking to bring it back to Canada to an accessible institution. However, we were chagrined to find, as others had before us, that our protests and declaration of its cultural significance and importance only served to enhance its value on the open market and drive the price further out of our reach. emotional, spiritual, and cultural capital quickly transformed into hard cash value. The museum's fundraising efforts, which were valiant, $1 million from its own budget, enhanced by everything from federal heritage grants to $50 donations sent from individual Métis and First Nations individuals, fell short. To date, the Southwest collection, which is actually quite small, set record auction prices. A single Blackfoot shirt set a record of $800,000, and the total sale of $4,521,402 exceeded the most optimistic forecasts. The Blackfoot shirt disappeared into private hands, but the Alberta Museum is home to the Cree firebags, where they have had their Métis provenance restored. The first item to come across the border was a woman's dress. She was greeted by joyous community ceremony and celebration led by the late Joan Cardinal Schubert, a Blackfoot Métis artist. Métis elder, author, and activist Maria Campbell and I drove to Edmonton for a quieter reunion where we were joined by two other women, a young Métis author and an artist. The Red River Bags aren't quite home, but they are at least close enough for a visit. The 1988 Spirit Sings exhibition triggered national protests and was the first public demonstration of the high emotions objects can trigger. It led to a task force and a renegotiation of our relationship with museums. The ideas articulated during that process have been unevenly implemented, and we must continue to fight so new generations of museum administrators and curators remember their obligations. But this has not stopped the continual loss, movement, and commodification of plundered culture. We stand at a crossroads of sorts in political and cultural arenas, a choice between reconciliation and continuing conflict. Who are the new collectors? Where are we in this exchange? Now, quite often, museums are our allies in this struggle. And because we did not vanish, we are adamantly claiming our rights to access and control our cultural heritage. We're still here. Thank you.
That was 2 seconds short.
Okay.
That's really impressive.
Cutting as I go. You're a scary guy. I'm like, oh my God, I can't go over time.
Thank you very much for that sharing. Our next presenter is Mehmet Polatel.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Professor Chalk for inviting me. I was honored to be here. And I want to begin with some notes on the importance of property issues in cases of mass violence, which was ignored in studies of Armenian genocide for a long time. Firstly, all cases of mass violence are accompanied by processes of dispossession and property transfer in some form. In case of the Armenian genocide, we can say that the process of dispossession and property transfer mainly took the form of systematic robbery orchestrated by the state. Before going through the details of the process of dispossession and property transfer during the genocide, we should note that the problem did not come out of the blue after a particular decision. In fact, before 1915, seized Armenian properties was one of the most acute problems of the Ottoman Empire. Most of these seizures were carried out during pre-genocide massacres, but they were not limited to that. As Armenians were stripped of any functioning legal means, and as they were seen as internal enemies, the seizure of Armenian properties gained an everyday characteristic during the 1890s. The usurpers in these pre-1915 cases were not the members of a single group. Among them were local authorities and public officials, other groups residents in the same locality, immigrants coming from Balkans and Caucasia, and Kurdish tribes, some of which were nomadic or semi-nomadic. So the process of dispossession did not start with the genocide. You can change the slide. I think it's
Not the other way. This, you have to give it a good poke. No, it's not. I must have burnt it out.
Okay. You can see here some of the Armenian properties seized before 1915. This data was collected by a commission established by the Armenian Patriarchate, and this commission prepared several reports on the issue between 1910 and 1912. Next slide, please. Okay, these were the community properties, meaning churches, monasteries, etc. Of course, this is not a complete list, but even this partial data gives us an idea about the extent of the problem. With 1915, the genocide, there were very important changes in the characteristics of the process of seizure. First of all, genocide radically expanded the scale of dispossession and property transfer. As all Armenians were subjected to deportation, the number of properties in question increased. Secondly, genocide introduced new dynamics into this process. As genocide itself was sum of acts orchestrated from the center, central authority became an actor directly involved in the seizures. This is not to say that the government had no role in the usurpations prior to 1915, but this early role was limited to establishing the ground for violence and encouraging perpetrators. As the state itself became a usurper with the genocide, there occurred a strong motivation on part of the state to handle this process under strict control of the center. This shift also reflected itself on the way of dispossession and property transfer. The most striking aspect of state involvement in this process is the fact that the seizure of Armenian properties, a clearly unlawful initiative which also contradicted the constitution and laws of the Ottoman Empire, was carried out within a framework which was intensely regulated by legal means. The Ottoman government issued several decrees, orders, and laws for the seizure of Armenian properties. As it was the case with the laws and orders about the deportation, the Young Turk government made use of judicial methods to provide a legal base for already ongoing policies. Can you change the slide, please? These are the list of the previous. Yes, this was the list of the law. And this systematic control over the properties and their liquidation also showed that the deportation was not brought out as a temporary precaution. And I will not bore you with the details of these laws, but here it should be noted that several legal arrangements were used for the legitimization of liquidation of Armenian properties, and Ottoman government continued to liquidate, sell, and distribute these properties systematically under the cover of law. According to this legal framework, every Armenian property, from lands and factories to soaps, livestock, and clothes, would be listed and registered by the state authority. And the commission names abandoned property commissions because the state called the Armenian properties the abandoned properties. And the process of transfer would be carried out after this process. Commissions would keep, these abandoned property commissions would keep notebooks indicating the details regarding the quantity and worth of these properties and real owners. What is more, these commissions would also note to whom these properties were sold or assigned in the process of property transfer. After this brief introduction to legal framework, I want to continue with the analysis of cycles of dispossession and property transfer and the tension that emerged between the expectation of the center and practice of property transfer at the local level. I use the term cycles of dispossession and property transfer for referring to interrelated and sometimes overlapping ways in which the Armenians were stripped of their properties. All these cycles can also be seen as a means of psychological and economic violence during the genocide. The seizure of Armenian properties by state authorities and their use in the service of the state can be considered as the first cycle or layer. In parallel to this legal process, Ottoman government distributed Armenian properties by several telegrams and orders issued to locals. It can be said that the government used Armenian properties in three ways. First, the Ottoman government used the Armenian properties for the settlement and provision of the immigrants in line with its policy of Muslimization and Turkification of Anatolia. Apart from homes, lands, and shops, their substitution and clothing were provided from Armenian properties. And the second objective of the central authority was eliminating the non-Muslim bourgeois and establishing a national economy dominated by Muslim and Turkish elements. It was ordered that local governments would distribute necessary shops, capital, and tools to Muslims. And Armenian properties were also used for war efforts and for institutional interest of government agencies. The state gave some buildings to the use of the army, and sale revenues of crops from vineyards and gardens were also given to the army. Several buildings belonging to Armenians were converted into prisons, police station, and government offices. Moreover, various goods like clothes, drugs, timbers, and tools were used for providing the needs of the army. The government also made use of the abandoned properties, the Armenian properties, for the expenses of the militia organization and for deportation costs. As you may see here, the communal buildings and church properties were also seized by the government. These are the most significant church properties in Adana region. And this list also regarding the number of seized houses in Adana also shows the extent of the seizure during the genocide. Despite the projections of the center, the local officials and military personnel used their power and authority to lay their hands on Armenian properties for their individual interests. This could be seen in cases of extortion. Many civil and military officials promised to spare the lives of wealthy Armenians who were willing to pay generous amounts of money. In fact, this was an extortion scheme. It is true that a tiny number of Armenian families were spared, but this was only because they were considered to be necessary by central authorities. For example, blacksmiths in Diyarbakir region were exempted from deportation after a while because otherwise their services would not be provided in any possible way. Thus, local authorities lacked the authority to provide exemptions, but they promised it anyway. There are several examples of this, but here I will only mention one from Adana provinces. It is the historical provinces for the Armenians, the southern region of Turkey. It's called also Cilicia. In Adana, an Armenian named Hagop Ohanyan assisted police captain Cemal Bey, who had married his sister in squeezing Armenians for their money in exchange for delays in deportations. They issued temporary staying permissions. In line with this, a group of richest Adana Armenians collectively paid a sum of 7,000 Turkish liras in the name of municipal taxes, which was in reality personal bribes for Cemal Bey and the governor Hakkı Bey. However, once the extortion victims ran out of money to deliver, they were deported anyway. Apart from establishing this kind of extortion schemes or ignoring the escapes of certain individuals from deportation convoys in exchange of bribes, local officials also seized certain immobile properties like houses, shops, and lands for their individual use. This was actually forbidden by several orders and rules, but since their cooperation on the genocide was very important, the state did not take any harsh steps against this in the first place. The case of Dr. Mehmet Reşit can be seen as a crystal clear example of how corrupted high-ranking local officials could become during the genocide. Reşit, who is known as the Butcher of Diyarbakir because of his cruelty and violence, was the governor of Diyarbakir during the genocide. According to several witnesses, Reşit looted jewelry, precious stones, carpets, and antiquities, and later took them to Istanbul. Racette was convinced that he could get away with this embezzlement and dared to respond to an advertisement for a very expensive mansion in Istanbul, which was worth 9,000 liras. This act rose suspicions. For example, even the Minister of Education, Ahmet Şükrü Bey, would state that it was suspicious that Racette had arrived Diyarbakir with financial straits, but managed to buy that house only 2 years later. Thus, Racette's carelessness and confidence would jeopardize the enormous wealth he amassed, as an investigation would be carried out for his acts. These acts of high-ranking local officials and military personnel had a rub-off effect. Observing the shortcoming of this, the German consular staff wrote, "As the more senior officials attempt to enrich themselves in this manner, consider bribery and extortion to be a harmless and permissible act, and compromise the law and state's dignity, naturally they have no moral strength and authority to keep their subordinate officials, judges, doctors, officers, yes, even the gendarme and ordinary soldiers in check. Every public official looks for a way to get money at his own discretion." This brings us to what I term as the third cycle. Direct attacks on Armenians for material interest and looting during the deportation process. It should be stated that these attacks were carried out by several groups, including gendarmerie and militia, who were tasked with carrying out lethal attacks, and those who were not commissioned for violence but participated in it. The acts of Jandarma of Ulu Kuşla in Adana can be seen as an example of this kind of seizure. These men simply acted as an organized crime gang, threatening every deportation convoy, the route of which passed through Ulu Kuşla. They let those convoys that paid the sums they demanded to pass, but kill others who did not. For example, when the convoy from Izmit refused to pay, 7 notables among them were instantly killed by the gendarme. I want to conclude with an analysis of the effects of dispossession and property transfer on the Armenian people. The 3 cycles that I mentioned indicate that the Armenian genocide was interwoven with complicated and sometimes conflicting forms of dispossession and property transfer. The common denominator between the legal framework established by the government and individual acts of usurpers which transgress this framework is the fact that, in total, they brought with the economic annihilation of the Armenian people in the Ottoman Empire. Survivor memoirs, details which can be reached through an examination of court files, restitution petitions, and correspondence between Ottoman officials and institutions, shows that the process of dispossession and property transfer was much more than merely the loss of material properties and interest for the Armenian people. Destruction of churches and other community buildings and their conversion into prisons and camps as if they held no meaning at all, looting of houses by Muslim masses, loss of belongings of personal value, and attachment like wedding rings. The impact of all this cannot be understood as a loss of economic means. In fact, the cycle of dispossession and property transfer were elements of the genocidal violence directed against the Armenian community. Government institutions and authorities, state officials, neighbors, all were aggressively pushing their way on to get whatever they could from the Armenians. Even for those who managed to be spared from deportation through bribes at the initial phase, life was rendered into a long and horrifying waiting. For example, after escaping from prison and deportation convoys many times, Mr. Gazoros Çıplakyan, a very well-known businessman from Istanbul, had managed to turn back to Istanbul. He had seen so many horrors that he could foresee what was waiting him. Refusing the threatening suggestion that he could only survive if he paid 500 liras to Commander Racette and to convert to Islam, what worried him the most was the prospects of his family. In the restitution petition he wrote to the British authorities after the war, Çıplakyan said, "I sold all the goods I had in my shop at a very low price. The only reason for doing so was to provide my family as much money as possible. For I did not know what awaited me on the way. I might have been killed, and then the government would unjustly confiscate my shop, sell my goods, as it had done for other Armenians who were exiled, thus depriving my family of its last means of living. Then I explicitly told my wife to give no more bribes to save my life, for nothing would help this time. I was doomed to die." As it is well known, genocides are not the sum of murders and massacres. What differentiates them is the genocidal intent, which is the destruction of a group with its people, with its culture, with its group identity. Thus, genocides target the existence and life of a particular group of people as such. The process of dispossession and property transfer that I have examined were clearly part of these attempts to annihilate Armenian life in all aspects. This, of course, had tremendous and horrible effects on those who could survive. Here I want to conclude by quoting Elis Hagopian's memoirs, which capture the sentiments of the dispossessed and the feeling of becoming uprooted this brought with it. Most turn back for a fast look at homes in which they had spent a lifetime rearing families, begetting children and grandchildren, cultivating gardens and farms. All was now being left behind. The cattle, folk, precious rugs and silverware, mulberry trees, stores of food and drink. The uprooting was complete, the severing final. The destruction of life as we had known it, home, church, school, wealth, neighbors, vineyards laden with fruit, fields ripening for the fall harvest, was total. Thank you.
Thank you. We're running according to schedule, I think. Well, the adjusted schedule. Our final panelist is Elazar Barkan.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here. I was asked to speak about the impact of reparation and restitution on Jewish life, and as I was writing the paper, I made the distinction and the decision to speak very little about art and to explain why I speak very little about art. But given this week, I will stick to my decision. There are plenty of people who know a lot about it, and it's plenty in the news, so I will talk more about the impact of the discussion and disputes on reparation on Jewish community life. So let me begin with the comments about the German repentance after the Holocaust, which has achieved an iconic status among nations that atone for historical crimes. And a large part of it was evident in the German reparation to Jews and to Israel beginning in the 1950s. For almost 4 decades, until the end of the Cold War, this was largely an exceptional case of reparation. It was then, at the end of the Cold War, when the question of transition to democracy in a growing number of countries, together with redress for historical crimes, led to a new international aspiration for accountability, which included reparation and restitution. This is where the Holocaust reparation played aspirational universal role. Some of this was evident in the fast-evolving transitional justice field, where reparation was a component of restorative justice policies. Most of the energy in transitology, however, was directed at retributive justice, that is, at bringing perpetrators to justice, to court, and in creating mechanisms to narrate the violence and the atrocities through truth commission or analogous mechanisms. While the victims were the purported focus, testimonies from victims provided the moral and evidentiary content for the various procedures. Little relatively was done to rebuild the lives of survivors. globally. I was going to speak about South Africa here, but just keep it in brackets. Although there is an emerging international norm of the right to reparation, and the topic receives much attention in discussions of political transitions, without exceptions, the programs themselves are limited, and in most cases, more symbolic than rehabilitating. It is against this background that the German reparation for Holocaust victims remains an even more exceptional. Furthermore, reparation for Holocaust victims and losses involve a whole set of issues that are not present in other cases, primarily, but not exclusively, the question of citizenship and residency. In democratic transitions, the beneficiaries, or the aspirational beneficiaries, are the citizens of the country that hands out the reparation. This largely is not the case in the Jewish reparation. When I published my book, The Guilt of Nation, in 2000, I did not anticipate the momentous events and the dramatic shift the world was to undergo within a year. The book focused on two categories of reparation: those involving post-World War II cases, from Europe to Japan to the United States, and the second set of cases from post-colonial world involving largely indigenous peoples in the debate over reparation and the debate of reparation for slavery. These were the high days of reparation. There was relatively a growing public support, and several unprecedented reparation programs were instituted, including to Japanese Americans, controversial reparation payments proposal for sexual slavery known as comfort women in East Asia, indigenous peoples in Australia and New Zealand, and there was almost a legitimate conversation about reparation for slavery in the United States. At the time, I believed the growing attention and demands for reparation meant a new era was evolving and politics would move towards growing recognition and atoning for crimes and historical injustices. During the Clinton administration, the topic received extensive and high-profile diplomatic attention, and the US was pressuring various countries in Europe to step up and pay reparation, while liberal democracies were increasingly willing to shoulder the burden of acknowledgement and exploring amending historical violence. The trajectory seemed clear as more avenues were opening for reparations and countries were signing on to multitude forms of redress. Perhaps the clearest manifestation was the outcome of the Stockholm International Forum on the Holocaust in 2000, when representatives of 46 countries signed a declaration committing their government to promote Holocaust education, remembrance, and research both domestically and at the international arena. They also established the Holocaust Memorial Day, recognizing that the Holocaust as a cosmopolitan moral yardstick for evil was, I quote, fundamentally challenged the foundations of civilization, and declaring that its unprecedented character will always hold universal meaning. An international organization structure was put in place, and the Holocaust became the formal symbol for evil which the civilized world committed not only to fight, but also to redress. Yet, within a year, the international agenda dramatically changed, and the following years were characterized by the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the growing role of Islamic fundamentalism, and the war on terror. Concurrently, but unrelated, while the Holocaust was being formally declared ever more universal, achieving a global iconic status, the attitudes toward it in the region where it had been perpetrated most horrendously, in Eastern Europe, became more controversial. Central and Eastern Europe saw a growing debate over the comparison between Stalinist and more broadly Soviet crimes and Nazi atrocities, between nationalists and liberals. The specifics in each country differed, but the overall impact is similar. While in Western Europe, the Holocaust represents universal values and is emblematic of the ultimate evil, there is a deep tension in Eastern Europe where the local meanings sees it as one manifestation of one horrific crime contextualized in a long string of violent regimes in the region. The debate over the place of the Holocaust as the ultimate evil remains the work in progress. So let me say few words about Jewish reparation. The Holocaust largely achieved its goal in Central and Eastern Europe. That is, the destruction of the Jewish world was almost complete. Consequently, when Germany agreed with Israel and the World Jewish Congress on reparation and compensation, the money was directed largely to Israel, to survivors, descendants, much of it in Israel and in the West. There was no Jewish community in Germany, and Eastern Europe was behind the Iron Curtain. The focus of the reparation was on assisting individual survivors and their descendants. In addition, Israel received development assistance, but the focus remained largely on individuals, and little efforts were directed towards community property or rehabilitating the destroyed communities. The total reparation sum paid was significant. Calculations differed, but the magnitude is roughly $100 billion over 6 decades plus. It is by far the largest reparation program anywhere. This, however, is insignificant if compared to either the German GNP over the same period of time or the Jewish losses in the Holocaust. The point I am making is that we have only vague and not well-articulated norms for what an adequate reparation program might look like in cases of mass atrocities. The criticism of various Holocaust reparation programs, particularly from survivors' organizations with regard to specific agreements, such as over-insurance policies, suggests that it is unlikely that adequate compensation for such losses can be envisioned, let alone implemented. There is not a single program that can serve as a model. If we take domestic compensation for individual victims as a standard, the magnitude of the challenge may be imagined. This raises the question, what is the goal of reparation program? To rebuild lives? To compensate for the loss and suffering? To punish the perpetrators? Or merely to help in minimal way for the survivors in their daily struggle? Jewish reparation provided foremost recognition and acknowledgement of the crimes. But it also did aid significantly Israel's economy, and it meaningfully assisted many survivors, some of them for decades. Following the end of the Cold War, a new vista for reparation was opened for survivors in Eastern Europe. Each country in the region had adopted different policies of transition, which included a mix of retributive policies such as few trials, limited lustration, as well as a set of restitution policies. The primacy of market economy for all the new governments in the region overshadowed any other consideration, yet there was a noticeable effort to legislate ethical policies and to privilege constitutional questions which intertwined with human rights. As privatization and ethical policies quickly became contradictory, market economy largely won. Ethical policies, especially demands of reparation and restitution, meant long historical investigations which the rapid transition seemed to preclude. Redress came to mean cosmetic changes to privatization policies which maintained the status quo, a conservative regional revival and middle-class politics without any dramatic redistribution of either social or historical considerations. Jewish demands for restitutions were fueled by mourning and the claim for recognition of the tragedy, by efforts to come to terms with history despite low expectations and frequently minimal returns. The demands for restitutions were fueled by, the demands focused on material assistance to the immediate victims and building a new future. To that end, within few years, the World Jewish Restitution Organization was established in 1993 to research restitution cases and national laws and to organize the negotiations on behalf of the community remnants and various governments. The Jewish moral and even partially organizational response was determined by the previously established institutionalized mourning, which now aimed to adjust the German model to the new situation. The target was to revive extinguished communities and assist individuals to reclaim their own property. The new constellation presented fresh opportunities to strengthen the remnant of local Jewish communities and to claim communal properties such as synagogues, cemeteries, schools, hospitals, sport facilities, and cultural property. But in addition to the institutional responses, there were many individual claims. Some of those isolated, painful, often naive attempts were a testimony to the private and less articulated melancholy that informs the formal established communal policies. Others were urged on by lawyers and advocacy groups. Some of these advocates are more mercenary, primarily motivated by the possibility of financial and political gains in the Jewish and Israeli domestic scene, presenting extreme demands. Often these politicians are characterized by their hawkish rhetoric, which demands for total restitution of all lost property. This political grandstanding also explains some of the exaggerated predictions about anticipated restitution. Such was the prediction, for example, that the restitution in Eastern Europe will surpass the German reparation. Others suggested that the restitution, I quote, could transform the face of Europe, revitalize Jewish continuity, create economic dislocation through wholesale transfer of wealth in Central Europe, triggering outbursts of anti-Semitism. End of quote. No data substantiated this rhetoric. The highest estimate predicted restitution in the amount of 10 billion, but even that sum is not supported by any real data. Nor would such a sum transform the economy in Eastern Europe. Yet these statements informed hopes as well as created fears of backlash. The estimate by the World Jewish Congress at the end of '97 claimed that material damages suffered by Eastern European Jews during the war would total somewhere in between 230, somewhere in the range of 300 billion, not to confuse with two precise numbers. The more responsible, eventually more effective Jewish policies involved the local community as much as the leadership of the World Jewish Congress. By the late 1990s, the questions of Jewish restitution received extensive international attention. The highlight was, as mentioned already in this conference, the 1998 Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets, which included the representative of 44 countries which focused on confiscated art, insurance, and communal property. It highlighted moral obligations to pursue restitution and the non-binding mechanism of transparency of suspected looted art provenance. An ongoing push for new legislation became the main emphasis, together with a focus on what was viewed by several countries as the most ominous topic of heirless property. That's a big fear. These were important achievements before Clinton left office and Under Secretary of State Stuart Eisenstadt ended his successful mission. The atmosphere in 2000, as I mentioned, was full of promise. The redress for the Holocaust did not only focus on restitution, but became a symbol for international commitment to never again. The Holocaust stood for the failure not only to save Jews, but also for the failure in Bosnia and Rwanda, fighting for the survivors of the Holocaust and promoting its legacy, portrayed to many the better selves of liberal democracies. This brings us back to the Stockholm Declaration in 2000, which came at the high point of restitution politics, and just before the end of the Clinton administrations. New agreements had been signed with Germany. There was an overall growing recognition of the significance of the Holocaust. The contested narratives in Eastern Europe were yet to present a real challenge to the new European consensus, and the participants in the conference could declare that the Holocaust will always hold universal meaning. They pledged to promote education, remembrance, and research about the Holocaust. Restitution was not part of the agenda, but the relative success in the 90s informed the expansive and the expanded agenda. This was followed by 3 more Stockholm International Forum conferences until 2004, devoted to combating racism, anti-Semitism, ethnic hatred, and ignorance of history. And just as the legacy of the Holocaust reached its widest impact, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were capturing public attention, moral politics fell out of favor, and survivors receded from the headlines. This was Holocaust remembrance in its cosmopolitan guise. Very little progress was made since 2000. Frustration at the general failure to pursue restitution during the Bush administration years led to renewed effort towards the end of the decade, and the convening of representatives of more than 45 countries in Prague Holocaust-era Assets Conference in June of 2009, where they agreed on the Terezin Declaration. This was a notable achievement given the stalemate on the topic for several years, but the results were modest at best. Since the process is entirely voluntary, the best the conference could achieve was publicized guidelines and best practices and the establishment of a European Shoah Legacy Institute. The declaration principally followed and renewed the guidelines of the Washington Conference. Both the Prague and the Prague Conference and the guidelines were seen as a major achievement following the decade of largely a stalemate. The international diplomacy continued, and another conference was held in Prague the year later. This was the largest international effort to revive restitution of Jewish property, primarily in Eastern Europe. The goal of the conference was to, I quote, review the development in the field of restitution and compensation of Nazi confiscated and otherwise misappropriated properties. The aspirations were high, that it would serve as a natural institute and would utilize the European human rights regime to foster restitution. American support was in the background, and the new Jewish Museum in Warsaw is a testimony that Poland is marching to its own tune in the matter. The conference devoted a panel discussion to communal and religious property, which include building and land use for religious and communal purposes and income. Mostly, this includes synagogues, cemeteries, schools, etc., as well as land owned by Jewish communities. The representatives of the panel from Hungary, Lithuania, Greece, Poland, and Russia explained the difficulties, but had little positive to respond. The discussions identify specific problems from inadequate legislation to the problem of citizenship, etc. None of that was new. The conversations very often repeated themselves for over 2 decades, yet the survivors and their representatives have not given up, and the struggle is ongoing. I had some comments about plundered art now.
You technically have 1 minute left.
That's the question to the chair. Okay, so let me go to conclusion. I just skipped the plundered art. Reparation for Jews after the Holocaust has 3 layers: individual, community, and universal. The impact on the community, not in the narrow sense of a local community, but on the larger Jewish identity, is foundational. The Holocaust became the identity marker for secular and little affiliated Jews and a core of group identity for all. The restitution politics kept it in the news, primarily in the 90s. The insurance scandals, the ambulance chaser lawyers gave it all a bad taste, but it was all part of Jewish politics. In Eastern Europe, the injustice of the installed restitution is the main non-news. Yet the small number of returned communal property enabled the building and maintaining of renewed small Jewish community, as is the case in the Czech Republic and Hungary. This was done in the 1990s. What is the future? Probably much the same. Advocacy will continue, the last survivors themselves will die, but the need to establish a community in each of the countries in Eastern Europe will inform diminished activism and may lead, for some policies, even short of legislation, to further limited restitution. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists for setting the stage for a really interesting discussion across these 3 cases. We'll take another 30 minutes for questions, and that will put us a little bit behind schedule. It will cut into the lunch period, but we will be reconvening here promptly at 2 o'clock to begin our 3rd panel. Let's start on this side.
Professor Polatel, your thorough knowledge of the Armenian question, especially the confiscation of the Armenian heritage, I congratulate you. I have 2 questions. First, those lists they put on, 95% are Turkish names, they're not Armenian. All those, I know the Armenian names which changed to Turkish. Plus, our mountain Ararat, which is the symbol of Armenia, has been changed to Turkish name. Second question, with your knowledge so much of an Armenian, and you're one of the 5 which I know that they know so much about the Armenians, they wrote books about the Armenians and the cleansing, also the genocide, how come the successive fascist militaristic governments and today's Islamic government still deny the misdeeds of their forefathers, and they don't want to compensate or repair the Armenian heritage? Whereby Germany has apologized and repaired fully to the Jewish nation. This is my second question. Being an Armenian national, my father's side was cleansed, ethnic cleansed 1905 from Sivas in Turkish, Sepastia in Armenian. My mother's side was caravan through Deir Zor to Syria and then to Egypt. Now, when will these people will recognize? There's only 5 of you. I know the names. Taner Akçam, who wrote books, and 3 others. Some, they do, but they don't have your courage. Like Jews, they say, next year in Jerusalem, we say the following. Last Armenian left on this planet will call for justice. Thank you very much.
About the name of Armenians and Turkish, I think it is from the Ottoman documents and it's written in Turkish name, but of course the Armenian used the Armenian name in their village or etc. But officially the change of the names from Armenian to Turkish is started with the establishment of Republic of Turkey. But I really don't understand the second question.
Okay. Don't answer.
Could you restate it very
Sure,
succinctly?
I'm going to make it short. Why not today's Turkey, like its past governments, does not recognize the Armenian genocide and do compensations, reparations, like Germany did to the Jewish Holocaust?
Yeah, it's because it is a big question. It's very, very big.
There is only about 5 of you
the state identity.
who are the guts and the courage to come out and talk about against the government. The others, they do not say one word. Don't hear, don't see, don't talk. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a very large
Very
question.
large
I mean, in some ways, this
Actually,
entire
maybe-
conference only
Maybe I can just
scratches the
offer a
surface.
quick comment. I think that over the last 10 years, I appreciate your work, but over the last 10 years, there's been an enormous growth in Turkey of people who are actually advocating for recognition and acknowledgement. And this is actually a very encouraging sign, although you are right in pointing to the government.
In 2 years, it's going to be 100
Sorry,
years.
I think just for
I
the
know, I have
purposes
said
of
this, I'm sorry.
of keeping on to our schedule.
Right.
We can wait another 100 years to be justified.
Thank you. We'll go to this side now.
Surely, if heritage is to be meaningful, it has to be a living, breathing thing and not fossilized exotica. It seemed to me that the panel indicated that efforts at repatriation, reparation, etc., have had negative as well as positive consequences. So my question to the panel is, what is their suggestion about means of increasing the positive and diminishing the negative aspects of these questions of reparation and restitution?
Would anyone like to speak to that?
This is a rather general question. I'll be holding you after lunch for that in order to discuss it. But to give it a very brief answer, I think that you articulated it in your question. The question is whether the heritage can be grounded in a living tradition, in a living community. And I think all the 3 papers here have indicated that there are difficulties, there are constraints, there are limitations, but there's clearly, each of those cases is driven primarily by an advocacy of a living community that is determined to revive its heritage or more likely, the memory of its heritage.
The impression, unfortunately, is often to do more with reparation and restitution than it is on the living heritage. It seems to me that it's more to do with punishment of the past rather than prospects for the future.
Would you, Sherry or Mehmet, would you?
I didn't talk about punishment at all, I don't think. It's maybe a bit sarcastic from time to time. But absolutely, the return of our objects is very much, when it happens, going to living, vibrant, restorative. I mean, the culture ban was lifted in 1951. And almost immediately, efforts to reclaim objects from communities started. And efforts to, I mean, it was almost like once the word got out, because it was done very quietly, and it has a kind of interesting little story about how that might have happened. But once people got the word out, because there was no official announcement, there was no rescinding, there was no legislation, there was nothing public, just an issue of the Indian Act, a new edition was published, and the culture ban was simply not in it. So it took a while for the word to spread, and once it did, it was like people picked up their needles, the drums started sounding, the songs started to be sung, ceremonies could be held, sundances are still happening, potlatches are still happening, sweats are happening. People dance again, and we've been doing it ever since the culture ban was lifted, and we did it while it was on. We just went in secret and persisted. Now, the restoration of objects, or even the reconnection of objects, can really facilitate a kind of healing and further regeneration. And an example of that would be a project with 4 Blackfoot shirts that had been collected in Alberta in 1840 by Governor George Simpson as part of that cultural imperialism movement. Those aren't covered by any heritage legislation because of the time period that they were acquired, but they're deeply significant. And there was a collaboration between the communities and the museums. The shirts were brought back. They were exhibited in Alberta. But one of the things that happened, I was just at a conference where people from the community were talking about how they engage students in the high school and the kind of almost like a ripple. The shirts have come, they've gone back. The people didn't get them back, but they got the knowledge back. And just that experience has had, transformative might be a bit of an exaggeration, but the positive benefits of that are still unfolding.
Thank you. Just a reminder to keep questions very brief, and we simply can't allow for follow-up questions. That those conversations can be pursued during the lunch break.
Hi, this is directed at Dr. Barkan. I had the pleasure of serving on many of these projects dealing with reparations. And so here's the, I don't know if it's a question or comment, but I'll make it actually a quick comment and ask for your feedback. Restitution basically is, to me, the true form of justice. In other words, I steal from you, I have to give it back to you. But the Holocaust was so sweeping that all Jewish property that was available for seizure was basically recycled and Aryanized, and essentially new businesses basically emerged as a result of these recyclings. So at the end of the war, essentially it was impossible to restitute physically because it meant that you had to untangle all the new businesses that had been created during the war. So reparations is the next best thing. But reparations to me is like a toothbrush settlement. So my question to you is, why is it that the international Jewish community has shied away from basically trying to make a very clean break between the war and the post-war? And because by not doing so, it essentially has created a historical continuity of plunder and thievery, at least not consciously, but by mitigating against the actual implementation of true justice. What we have done basically is enabled the people who plundered by keeping the fruits of their plunder. So, your comment.
Thank you. That's an opportunity. I'm not sure that I fully understand the dichotomy that you present, but let me try and we can continue that. I think that, first of all, we have to recognize that when reparation started with Germany, there was never previously, and I've been asking this question for 15 years now, there's never been an example that I know of an unenforced reparation previously. So when the reparations were imposed on Germany after World War I, that was imposed and they were forced to pay it. That's the regular form of reparation. So the whole notions of reparation without an imposition is a novel idea in the 1950s and the beginning, and I don't need to tell you, but it's obviously a dramatic shift. It's a work in progress. Now, to give up, that's not in the power of anybody. To give up aspiration, to give up memories, that's always part of it. I am not sure that what I didn't understand in your comment is what is meant by a clean break. It's hard for me to imagine. I can see aspirations, I can see frustration, I can see policies that are attempting to gain as much as possible, and through that going through the process of learning that we've been hearing. And in that regard, the Holocaust is not unique and is not different than many other kinds of forms in which reparation, the material reparation is a component of the cultural significance for the society. But perhaps at some opportunity you'll explain to me what a clean break might look like.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a question for Professor Barkan, but anyone else could address it as well. Professor Barkan, you expressed a discomfort with discussing plundered art. But so while discussing the legal and political regimes involved in reparation, I just want to suggest I agree that when discussing gassed bodies and people being shot and expelled, it's difficult to discuss property and artwork and artifacts, yet at the same time this art and artifacts represent the right not only to a property right, but to the subjective expression of vision and identity and meaning, which we've heard so eloquently in two of the presentations, whether it's the right to a wampum belt, which is both an artifact and a historical document, to the right of a vision that directly challenges the ideology of genocide, a right to an artwork which has 4 dimensions or is abstract. These visions are also being eradicated, and the identities and cultures they express are being eradicated in the genocide. So could you please address the issue of plundered art, not just as a property value, but also as a right to the subjective expression of vision, or to the right of a communal expression of vision and identity?
Thank you. I obviously agree with what you said. I did not mean to say, and if I gave that impression, it was only because I meant to say I'm not talking about the plundered art because I ran out of time, not because I think that it's insignificant. There's a difference, however, between the plundered art that is discussed with regard to the Holocaust than with regard to the indigenous peoples that we have heard here. And the main difference is that the Jewish expropriated, stolen art has more to do with European culture and with modernism or with European collections, and not just modernism, but we hear more about that. And it has to do with a lot of collectors, and it has to do with individual justice, and it has to do with individuals whose property was plundered. It has much less to do with Jewish communal culture. We're not talking, and we don't hear about community property, religious property, etc. This has been an aspect of the restitution that received very little attention from thousands of communities in Poland. There are now 12 or 16, I think. All of that is disappeared, and it doesn't receive not the attention of the Jewish world organizations, and very difficult from the local communities as well because of fear of increasing anti-Semitism if larger demands. So this is a real problem when we talk about cultural heritage in Central Eastern Europe. However, as we see this week, the questions of who owned modernist art or modern art is very critical. But it's critical not from the community perspective. It's not Jewish in that sense. It is Jewish collectors that suffered. It's individual justice. So I would say that there's a big difference between culture that is pertinent to the, or cultural property that is pertinent to the culture of the community and property that is of cultural value.
I'm going to disagree with your distinction, but I'll let you have it.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the audience, and I want to thank all the members of the panel for the exceptional discipline they've shown in helping us to keep to a reasonable schedule. We're going to stop the discussion formally, the formal discussion, I mean to say now, and we're going to reconvene at 2 o'clock promptly, and we're going to start at 2 o'clock. Monica Eileen Patterson, I forgot to mention that you were a member of our organizing committee when I passed the microphone to you. And like Janet Brooke, who will follow you as a chair after lunch, you served on the organizing committee, and we're very grateful for your contribution. And to all the members of the panel, it was incredible. It really, what a wonderful contrast. What a stimulating set of presentations. Thank you so much. We'll start at 2 o'clock. See you then.